you definitely see that effect in those wider rows where there's just more sunlight coming in. But the other thing that you see, and maybe we should just move down here and look at this because it's really impressive.
As you're walking, Pete, so we were talking with Rick, and he did some zapping of weeds because he's organic. Our question was when Bob mentioned this, spraying a strip for your corn to go in, if we narrowed that zapper down to an 8-inch zapper and went down through there once or twice before we planted that corn. But our question was, what would that do to the biology with that electricity? Is it worth thinking that far ahead?
I would love to know the answer to that. I don't know.
Because we don't want to spray chemicals.
Yeah, I don't think it would probably affect them, but I don't know. I've never heard anybody say one way or another of how far through the soil that electricity, that electrical current travels. Same way with flaming. You can burn the crap out of it, but if you get it too hot, what are you doing to the biology right over that strip? It's probably going to recover because it's hot, but it's not hot for long. And I know there's mixed, flaming is a mixed bag too, depending on grasses versus broadleaves and what stage it's in. And then if you have a bunch of dry matter down there from previous year's cover crop, you can set the whole thing on fire too. So yeah, there's pros and cons to a lot of that. So one of the things I want to point out here is that, certainly the corn is suppressed in these 90-inch rows. I want you to look at the color of the cover crop strips. Now, pretty sure Bob didn't come out here and put extra fertility on these strips. This is showing you what a good diverse mix that has some legumes, and it's not super heavy legumes, but there's some, what it can do when you have the biology working for you. And it probably was aggressive enough that, it's creating biology for this mix, but I don't know that a lot of it got over to the corn, not yet anyway. And eventually, as we build nitrogen into the system, as our organic matter levels build, we're going to see that, start to flow more out from this mix into the cash crop. Just didn't happen this year, but, that's great color. I would say that's hardly deficient in anything. And which is kind of amazing given the fact that there was nothing put on it, and there, probably wasn't a huge nutrient bank to begin with in this. So that gives us hope of how a diverse system, how a diverse mix can work. We just got to figure out now how to kind of pull this back a little bit so we're not hurting this as much. And again, as we have more nutrients cycling through the system, if we get back to more normal rainfall events and more normal rainfall pattern, this would look significantly different. But
for that, Bob, did we talk about what was the planting date, how big along, do we know what the actual planting date and then the growth stage on the corn?
Good question.
It was
pretty small. So
yeah,
so that could be, wait another week. It might have been competing, just the timing of letting the corn get another week or
And that's a good point, Mitchell. As a general rule, the wider your rows, the more you can err on waiting, because waiting on a 30-inch row means you lose your sunlight opportunity. Waiting on a 90-inch row, you're maybe going to lose a sunlight opportunity in the first 3 or 4 inches. Well, that's okay. I don't want that cover crop being that aggressive or great there anyway. I'm still going to get plenty of sunlight here. So you absolutely could wait till V4, V5 on this, where on the 30-inch rows, you better be going at V3.
At the risk of being defensive, Mitch, is my fear was not letting the weeds get started.
Yeah.
My biggest fear here was that this is going to turn into a weed bank because of no herbicides.
Yeah.
And you didn't have any cover crop. There was no winter cover crop out here.
No.
Yeah.
This is the first year out of this. So the thought process was, in my simple-minded view of it, is we want the corn to win the race to the sunlight, but we want the cover crop to come in a close second. But what your comments are really appropriate on the.
So this gets back to a question that was asked earlier, and I don't know that we fully addressed it. Was what would you do now? What would you do now in preparation for next year? If it was me, I would come out here and plant cereal rye and probably some hairy vetch across the whole thing. because that's going to give you the weed suppression out
Early next spring, yeah.
Yes. Now, is it going to take moisture? Yes. If your dry pattern continues all the way through next spring, it's probably going to hurt you. Not going to lie. We've seen cover crops hurt our crops in dry springs when you don't terminate them on time. If it looks like it's going to be really dry, you terminate earlier. If it looks like it's going to be a wet spring, you can roll the dice and kind of let it go out a little longer. Now, you're going to get the weed suppression from the cereal rye. You'll get the nitrogen fixation. I would be a little worried about the amount of carbon that we have out here now. And if we planted solid cereal rye, we come out here and we plant, 70, 80 pounds of cereal rye, and we let it get 5 feet tall and we roll it down and plant, that is a lot of carbon out here. It will have a really good weed suppression, but in order for the microbes to break that carbon down, they have to pull nitrogen from somewhere to do that. And the bugs always eat first. They will pull it away from the crop in order to cycle and decompose your residue if they have to. And you will see this again, even though you've got nitrogen in your system, it's not available to the plants if the microbes are hogging it all to decompose all the carbon that you left there. So that's where I would add some cereal, or I would add hairy vetch, which is going to be the best overwintering legume. I wish we had more options right now. Again, I mentioned that I dropped some winter peas off to Corteva. They're looking at. We've got a new variety of winter pea. Well, it's been out for a few years. We're really excited about it. It's a selection out of an Austrian winter pea done by the University of Wyoming over a period of 6 or 7 years. We've been using it for 5 or 6 years now. We've got one of our growers in northeast Nebraska, which isn't as cold as you guys are here, but they're pretty cold. And he's successfully grown them, planted them in the fall, had them over winter every year, and harvested seed. All but 1 year when he had an ice storm in March that killed him. It wasn't the winter that killed him. We like it so well that we're not selling any of them because we're sticking them all back in the ground to try to grow them for more seed production. So there's some hope on some winter peas. I don't know that we're there yet.
With the amount of biomass he's got here and no livestock and something that fits down the rows, and he knows where his rows are going to be next year, would you strategically plant the winter peas or vetch right where your rows are going to be, and then the cereal rye rather than mixing it? I mean, and would that, or would you just do winter peas and roll all that down, and would that be enough biomass to get you through without the weed control?
Yeah, so the question is, would I essentially try to do a biological strip till by planting something different where I know my corn row is going to be, and then something different in the middles? I've seen that work. I've seen it work pretty decent if you have the right equipment to do it. I would probably, instead of just going all my hairy vetch is here and all my rye is here, I might do that. I don't know. Yeah, I'd have to think about that. I may just go a much heavier concentration of vetch with less rye right over the corn row, and so basically I have two blends.
Yep.
But they're different percentages based on what I'm trying to accomplish there. With the winter peas, I'll tell you this, and we're going to do this again. We always do a bunch of plots at our farm there in Nebraska. And so last year we planted our overwintering plots October 1st after we harvested soybeans. And this is under a pivot, but we never watered it in the spring. So October 1st planting, and we planted couple different varieties of winter peas, about 5 kinds of hairy vetch, all in strips, monoculture strips, because we wanted to evaluate just what that would do. And then we had combinations of cereal rye and hairy vetch, 10 and 20, 15 and 30, just different combinations. Then we had straight cereal rye, straight triticale, straight wheat, winter barley, winter oats, and annual ryegrass. And then what we call the vacuum cleaner mix, which is everything that you vacuumed out of the drill plant in your plots, you just go plant that. And then this spring we came in, we did some testing. We let that grow out until about the end of May. You do not invest a lot of money in legume cover crops if you want to be the first guy in the neighborhood to plant your corn. You'll never get your money back out of it. You gotta let them grow. And organic guys know that that's just what they have to do. So they're used to it. Conventional guys, that's a mindset that you have to overcome, that you can give up a couple of weeks of planting date and still be okay, and you will be. Guys do it all the time. And again, because it's not all about just yield, it's about profit. And so we let those grow out to the end of May. We took samples, we took clippings, we sent them into Ward Labs and had them analyzed, and then we came in and we planted corn, and we actually planted an old open pollinated Jimmy Red corn, and then we only put 30 pounds of nitrogen on that corn, and everything else it had to get out of the soil. And it was so distinctive looking at it throughout the summer that where those peas were and where the vetch was, it was 2 feet taller than where it was straight cereal rye. And the color was significantly darker green, so you could just see the nitrogen coming out of that. So the plot of these Wyoming winter peas that we had, and we got to 34 below zero. It's coldest that I've ever seen there in that part of Nebraska, but we had a foot of snow on the ground, and so we had the best overwintering cover crops we've ever had. So if somebody asks you about how cover crops overwinter, yes, temperature is important, but temperature means nothing if you have snow cover. Now, you just can't always guarantee you're going to have snow cover, so you got to kind of, play the odds. So we had great overwintering, but those winter peas planted October 1st, tested the end of May, were a little over 4 tons of dry matter, biomass accumulation, 240 pounds of nitrogen, and about a 16 carbon nitrogen ratio, which means that nitrogen is coming out of that in a hurry. It's cycling out fast, and that's why that corn was 2 feet taller, because it was 240 pounds of fairly quick release nitrogen and almost no weeds, because 4 tons of dry matter, that's a lot. That's a lot for peas. Hairy vetch, it wasn't quite as much biomass. It was 2.5 to 3 tons, 180 to 220 pounds of nitrogen produced out of the hairy vetch. And that's typically what we would see if you get a really good growth of hairy vetch out to mid-bloom. We've never seen peas like that, though. They were, in fact, we wish we had a whole field of them so we could go harvest them. They really look good. Obviously, the straight rye, the straight triticale, all those. I don't know that we even really tested those. We should have. I wish I had had a test just to see what our baseline nitrogen was in that. But here's the interesting thing. Where we had the combinations, where I had vetch and rye together, and I had 10 pounds of vetch, 15 pounds, and 20 pounds of vetch with different amounts of rye. Where I had, and it ranged from about 120 to about 160 or 170 pounds of nitrogen from those mixes, and 5-6 tons of dry matter biomass. But what was interesting with the 3 combinations, where I had the least amount of vetch, I had the most nitrogen in my overall sample. 10 pounds had more than 15, 15 had more than 20. It all had less than having 35 pounds of vetch by itself. And so I don't know if that was a fluke, or if that's telling me that, the rye was, there was some sort of synergy going on in there, that it didn't take as much vetch to create the same amount of nitrogen because of some I don't know. I tell people what we saw. I don't know why that happened.
But Keith, a clarifying question on that. Your nitrogen numbers you talk about, that's all in the above ground biomass from the biomass.
Only the above, yes.
Soil.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. We only took a clipping and sent it in.
Yeah.
We did not try to do a soil sample. And I know that there's some down there, but I also know there's some that you're not going to get released out of the biomass. So it's a good baseline, but yeah, there would still be some in the soil. But at mid-bloom, I've already pulled a lot of that nitrogen out of those nodules, and it is in the plant. Mm-hmm. If it's at vegetative pre-bloom state, there's going to be more in the root system. But as it goes reproductive, but that's a great thing about hairy vetch. One of the things that makes hairy vetch such a great cover crop, it's incredibly indeterminate. So I had, by the end of May, I had seed pods formed already they weren't mature seed, but they were getting there. And that plant was still actively in full bloom, and it would have gone on to bloom for another 6 weeks. It's incredibly indeterminate, so it grows vegetatively even though it's growing reproductively, which is what you want if you want to produce large amounts of nitrogen, because once the soybean plant starts blooming and goes reproductive, it is not producing nearly as much nitrogen in the nodules. It's moving that up out of there up into the pods and the seed. It's translocated, but it's a very determinate plant because it's done flowering, it's done growing vegetatively, it's just moving stuff around now at that point.
Keith, you talked about the nitrogen tie-up, but even where maybe you've got some legumes that can help with that in having lots of biomass there. But you have lots of biomass there, and you come back the next year and you've got ground cover. Your soil don't get as hot. You absorb more moisture. Other benefits that you might think of that maybe offset some of that nitrogen, or maybe you offset it with your plants.
Yeah, there's no doubt that there's going to be a lot of benefits that accrue from that. And like you mentioned, you know, you're going to cooler and wetter when you're trying to plant corn is a bad thing.
Right.
Cooler and wetter after you've got it planted, that's a beautiful thing. And so the key is you got to figure out how to get it planted so you can have the cool and wet in, you know, June, July, and August, because that's where the payback comes. So there's several things that I would do with this that would help you know how much of a big deal the nitrogen is. Since you've got all your strips running this way, I would run some nitrogen strips going this way. I would have a strip, you know, get out of where you're going to do your yield checks and tests, even if it's just a visual strip, but run a 15-foot strip where you put down, you know, 50 units of nitrogen, and right next to it do one with 100 units, and then just see how much of a difference it made. And you may see bigger differences, you know, where you had no cover crops. You may see bigger differences there than you see here. I don't know. I think it would just allow you. That's a fairly one-time thing to do. That would just give you a whole bunch more data points to look at. And so that's one thing that I think you could do here. You could also, if you wanted to plant your, you know, if you wanted to plant, say, rye and vetch combination, again, you could plant that perpendicular to where the rows run, and then you can also run, you know, okay, I'm going to do 10 pounds of vetch and 30 pounds of rye, and I'm going to do, you know, 15 pounds and 25. You know, you could do some different combinations of vetch and rye, and if you wanted to do a comparison and not do the whole thing to the same, you could, like say, you could kind of change that up too. So, you know, pretty soon we could have about 10,000 variables here for you, Bob.
That's what you wanted, was some more data points.
Yeah.
Right.
But those are the things that you just start thinking, okay, well, why did 10 pounds of vetch give me more nitrogen in that biomass sample than where I had 15 pounds? I have no idea. We're going to do it again. We don't replicate because we're lazy. I'm not going to lie to you. We're really good about planting plots. We suck at collecting any data. It's because planting plots, you can generally do that in a fairly short period of time, and it's usually not the busiest time of the year. Data collection always comes at the absolute busiest time of the year. And
But
so
an observation is still an opportunity.
we
to
have a
learn.
lot of options. Now we did, like I say, we did get some samples pulled and sent into Ward Labs, so we know some of those numbers. We just don't really know. There was, after I saw those, I wish we'd have done a lot more sampling and testing, and we will next year.
One of my concerns on some of this soil is so variable that I always worry that the soil that's gonna make it look different than what it is.
Yeah. And I think I don't know that you would replicate those nitrogen strips.
Yeah.
They would be more of an observation type thing.
Yep.
And we never tell people that we're doing research plots. We always tell people we're doing observation plots.
Those are important too.
That's the word he uses.
It's a much lower standard to have to meet.
So do you guys think there's any chance that this 90-inch row could yield with 60 or 30-inch rows with all this cover crop, or could be as profitable?
I think that Lauren, where's Lauren at?
He's
So-
Back over there.
I asked Lauren Steinloggy this question earlier, and I want him to kind of address this. I asked him how much he thought, you know, because when you're doing